Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Katie Sakura, Director of Family Programs here at the GFPD, and I will be your host for tonight's webinar, The Impact of Peroxisomal Disorder Symptoms, What We Learned from the EL-PFDD Meeting, Part 1. We will be taking time to answer questions at the end, but please go ahead and submit your questions at any time throughout the webinar. You can do this in the box located beneath the webinar player window, or I will be monitoring the chat box with assistance from Ryan Maple. So please feel free to use the chat box to submit questions too. And the Q&A button option down at the bottom of your screen also allows you to submit anonymously if you would prefer to ask anonymously. We have two incredible presenters with us tonight, Pamela Saikali and Dr. Mousumi Bose. They are two of the key individuals involved in collecting and analyzing vital data about peroxisomal disorders over the past 2 years and who are now developing the Voice of the Patient report. Pamela Saikali is a registered dietitian in Lebanon and will soon become a dietitian in the United States in June. She earned her bachelor's degree in nutritional sciences from the University of Belamon in Beirut, Lebanon, and recently completed a master's degree in nutrition and food science from Montclair State University. During her time at Montclair, Pamela worked alongside Dr. Bose on the EL-PFDD project, gaining valuable research experience in the field. Pamela is particularly passionate about working with rare diseases and aspires to become a genetic metabolic dietitian. She is deeply committed to improving the lives of patients with rare genetic disorders by providing specialized nutrition care and support. We also have with us Dr. Moshmi Bose. She is the mother of Alon Betzer, who was born in 2010 and died in 2011 from Zellweger spectrum disorder. As a result of her personal experience with her son, Dr. Bose refocused her career goals to study rare disease. Over the last several years, Dr. Bose has conducted research and published multiple papers on the role of the family caregiver in the management of rare pediatric disorders, as well as a recent literature review on the characterization of severity in Zellweger spectrum disorder. Currently, Dr. Bose holds a faculty position in the Department of Nutrition and Food Studies at Montclair State University in New Jersey, studying quality of life, patient-focused drug development, dietary assessments, and health equity issues in rare disease communities. Dr. Bose is passionate about learning what is important to rare disease families and using that information to improve their lives. Thank you both for being here tonight and to share with all of us. And Dr. Bose, I will now turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Katie, for that really nice introduction. I am super excited to be here tonight, and I'm really excited to be here with Pamela because she's done a lot of really the legwork here for this study. So we're really excited to share this information with you. So just to give you an overview of what we're going to be talking about tonight, this is really getting closer to trying to put all of this information. A lot of you took part in the EL-PFDD meeting that took place in May 2024, as well as all the preliminary data collection that we did prior to that. We're here just to inform you of like some of the things that we found. And this is, for a lot of you, these are your stories, right? So we're here in this sort of webinar format to present all of this information to you, but really what I'm sure Pamela hopes to really get out of this is feedback from you guys, making sure that we are representing all of you accurately and comprehensively as we put this report together for the FDA. So, certainly please feel free to ask questions, to submit questions at the end of this. And these slides will be available as well as the recording. I strongly encourage you to please feel free to reach out to me or Katie if you have any insight or any feedback on some of the information that we're going to be presenting to you tonight. So before we get into some of the data that we found that we are going to be reporting on tonight, I'm just gonna, I know a lot of you have probably heard me ad nauseum talking to you about what EL-PFDD is. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time rehashing this, but for those of you that might be new to this concept, when we're talking about patient-focused drug development, this really is meant to be an effort that was started by the FDA, and the sort of impetus to initiate this program was really based on the fact that well, in existing approaches that the FDA were employing to approve new medications for different diseases really didn't meaningfully incorporate the patient voice. And so this was really meant to sort of address that. And that they started this effort not just for rare diseases, but for all sorts of conditions about a decade or so ago. And then it sort of branched out into this idea of externally led patient-focused drug development, where the FDA realized that they could probably have a broader reach if they didn't run all of these efforts themselves, and at the same time really acknowledging that the FDA, they weren't the experts on a lot of these conditions, so they really leaned into the insight, the experiences that patient organizations had, and gave them this opportunity to take the lead in trying to organize a patient-focused drug development effort, sort of on their turf. So that's what we did. We had at the GFPD, we sent correspondence to the FDA asking them to basically greenlight an externally led patient-focused drug development initiative that would culminate in this meeting. So for us, as part of this EL-PFDD for peroxisomal disorders, what we did was prior to the meeting, we collected a lot of preliminary data to help inform the organization of this meeting that took place in May 2024. So we're going to be sharing that preliminary data as well as the data that we collected at the meeting in May. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what the next steps are, which will be putting all this data together in a report that we're going to be submitting to the FDA. And we'll talk about what that utility of that report is going to be. In brief, the idea is really to provide a community, including both patients, caregivers, and families overall, voice on educating the FDA and other stakeholders on the symptoms impacts, the current treatment landscape, and how future clinical trials in peroxisomal disorders should be designed. So what we're going to be doing tonight is, this is if anybody was there at the meeting or any of the preliminary data collection, that this was a huge effort, and we're not going to be able to go through every single thing that we went through at the meeting, and to be truthful, we're still analyzing a lot of this data. Remember, this was an 8-hour long meeting plus all of the other preliminary data that we collected. So we're going to be sharing all of this stuff with you in these sort of digestible parts. Tonight, we're going to be focusing on looking at reporting back to you what you guys shared on the symptoms that you or your loved one have been facing as a person affected by a peroxisomal disorder. What were the most impactful symptoms? What were those impacts of these symptoms? And then another sort of secondary objective of this effort was to really see, we know that there is a lot of diversity among patients that are affected by peroxisomal disorders, where they are in their journey, what are their overall lived experiences. So we tried to look at whether or not there were differences across specific groups. And we have a little bit of that data that we'll share tonight. So just to start us off, in terms of the people that were participating in these data collection efforts, so that includes the focus groups, this survey that we had also developed based on the focus groups, as well as the meeting itself. The people that were really giving us feedback were primarily caregivers, and we're talking about family caregivers, so that's a parent or a step parent, or somebody that was providing primary care for an individual with a patient with a peroxisomal disorder. So a lot of times, like I said, these were parents. And then we also wanted to include the perspectives of patients. The majority of the people that participated in this, as you would probably expect, are parents, but we did get some patient perspectives, and I think those were really, really invaluable, and I look forward to sharing some of those with you tonight. So I'm using this term PD to just talk about the generally peroxisomal disorders. What we included in our group were people with ZSD, which is a peroxisome biogenesis disorder, but we also had individuals representing people with D bifunctional protein deficiency, ACOX deficiency, and AMACR deficiency. So I'm going to, as I said before, a lot of this data that we collected was really you know, I was charged with collecting, doing this research, but I had a lot of help, and one of the sort of key people that participated in helping organize these studies was my master's student, Pamela Saikali, and so I really wanted her to be a part of this because a lot of this data it's her own. So Pamela is going to share a little insight on how we collected this community feedback through the focus groups, as well as for the survey and the town hall meeting. So I'm going to pass it over to you, Pamela. We'll tag team this a little bit, and we can go to we'll go to the next slide. You just tell me when you want me to go forward.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Bose. So we collected our data in 3 different phases. The first phase of the data collection, we started by moderating 3 focus groups with caregivers of individuals with peroxisomal disorders. When we did our preliminary analysis, we realized that we needed more information on specific topics, so we added an additional focus group and 2 individual interviews with also caregivers of PD patients. The information gathered from this phase, along with regulatory guidance from the FDA, was used to inform a comprehensive, mostly quantitative survey that was administered to caregivers of individuals with PD and to patients with PD. Following that, we organized our town hall meeting as part of the GFPD's Family and Scientific Conference, where caregivers and patients with PD were present, and they shared their experiences by participating in large group facilitated discussion as well as live polling. So in all of these modes of data collection, information gathered involved symptoms, impacts, management, and current treatments, as well as clinical trial participation and clinical trial needs. For today, we will only be talking about the results from the symptoms and the impacts, and later on in July, we will be sharing the rest of our findings. You can go to the next slide. So these were the questions related to the symptoms and impacts that were included in the semi-structured focus group and interview guide that we used for the focus groups and interviews. I'm going to keep the slide for a minute so you can just take a look at what the questions are.
And we used a lot of these questions sort of in the other data collection modes as well, just to see if there was, any additional information that we missed. So if you have any questions about these questions, please feel free to, add them to the Q&A. I'm going to go ahead and move on and talk about what we found during our focus groups, and then Pamela is going to hop back on when we talk about the data collection that we did for our online survey. So
I'm going to just jump in for one moment. I'm so sorry.
sure.
And just share, if there's anybody in the audience that has low vision and may not be able to see any of these slides, please know that we will be sharing this recording and sharing these slides. So you'll be able to view these questions at a later time as well.
Absolutely. So these focus groups, as Pamela showed earlier in the slide, were conducted in mid 2023, and it was just sort of, like I said, it was meant to be a starting point to get some feedback on how we want to organize our EL-PFDD meeting. So when we started recruiting for these focus groups, and I just want to highlight here, for many EL-PFDD meetings, I think there this feedback was collected by patient organizations. Me being a researcher and knowing that I was going to be getting information from individuals, and as what I see as research, I just want to just disclose that we did get institutional review board approval from Montclair State University to ensure that the questions that we were going to be asking our families were ethical and would pose minimal harm. So if anybody wants any information about, that, I'm happy to share that. But moving forward, when we started our focus groups in summer of 2023, we were able to recruit about 42 caregivers that participated in these focus groups. And among these 42 caregivers, they were representing 47 patients. And the majority of the people that participated in this were caregivers that were representing patients with ZSD. We had a lot of different sort of perspectives. So I'm going to be sharing that with you now. So keep in mind, our goal with these focus groups, really, like I said, this was our starting point, right? So what we were really trying to do is, we knew that, happening in, late spring, early summer of 2024, we were going to have this opportunity to share our experiences with regulatory agencies like the FDA. But 8 hours seems like a long time, but given that this is such a multi-system disorder, we wanted to really prioritize topics that would have the most impact. And that's really what these focus groups were about, is really getting feedback from families to see, what do you want to talk about at this meeting, when we have the audience of these regulatory agencies like the FDA. So starting off, I just want to give you an idea of the topics that were discussed in each of the focus groups. And, we'll get a little bit more granular in terms of the details of this. And I'll share a few of the quotes that were shared during these focus groups. But at the end of the day, with these focus groups, like I said, we just wanted to get a little bit of information of, we've got a lot of different symptoms that we're contending with, right? A lot of different impacts. What do families want to talk about? And what we found overall among these families is that in every single focus group and every single interview, there was discussion of sensory impairment. And I'm limiting sensory impairment to really just focus on vision and hearing impairment. But in every single focus group, every single interview, this, either vision loss or hearing loss was discussed as a topic. In every single focus group, every single interview, there was a discussion about mobility issues. In every single focus group, every single interview, there was discussion about gastrointestinal symptoms. So this really started giving us a very clear idea of, okay, well, we at least know of some of the things we're going to be talking about during the meeting. In addition to that, we had people talk about intellectual disability. We had people talk about neurological symptoms, including seizures and leukodystrophy. We had people talking about adrenal insufficiency. We had people, some people talking about respiratory symptoms. So we really just sort of in a bit of a hierarchy, got an idea of what were the symptoms that people wanted to talk about, the symptoms that they found had the most impact on their child's daily lives. So this is just a rundown. Again, these slides will be available to everybody so that you can do a little bit more deeper dive. And that's going to be particularly important because I'm not going to go through every single quote that's here, but I wanted to just give you some evidence of some of the things that were discussed. We have, I showed you this table of, the overall topics. Here's a little bit more detail of some of the things that were said. So certainly there were people that talked about vision and hearing loss. People were talking about how certain symptoms were kind of the ones that they were dealing with the most in their child's daily lives. gastrointestinal symptoms and feeding. I want to include right now here, if you see this person is this person in under the gastrointestinal symptoms and feeding, they're talking about vomiting and reflux and overall feeding issues, but this also includes liver issues as well, and those were certainly discussed, and we'll go in once we get to the information that we gathered from the town hall meeting. I'll be able to go into a little bit more detail with that. So here are, just like I said, this is meant to just serve as an example of some of the things that were said during the focus group. If anybody has any questions that they want to, or comments, please feel free to add them to the Q&A, and we'll make sure that they get addressed at the end. So as Pamela and I have mentioned, tonight's webinar is really meant to be focusing on the symptoms and the impacts. So the next table that you're going to see is looking at the impacts, the specific impacts that each of these symptoms have. And we kind of grouped them into several categories. And what we found in our focus groups, starting off, was really that the majority of the families, when they talked about what were the specific impacts that the symptoms of peroxisomal disorders had on their child's daily lives, it was really with respect to independent activities of daily living. So that includes, feeding, dressing independently, bathing, just doing these activities of daily living independently. And in general, we found that most caregivers reported that their child really struggled with that or could not do them at all, and that the caregivers were responsible for making sure that these activities were executed. Additionally, we found impacts on social interactions, and this includes just overall communication, but also interacting with friends and families. When we're talking about executive functioning, we're talking about making sure the memory focus, emotional regulation, decision making, concepts like that, school and work performance, depending on where they are at in their peroxisomal disorder journey. And then to a lesser extent, we found people talking about the impacts of peroxisomal disorders on issues. These are not necessarily daily impacts, but they are pretty significant impacts, including hospitalization and physical injury. So I'm going to go to the next slide, which is going to show some sample quotes describing what was specifically said with respect to the impacts during the focus groups. And I'll give you guys just a second. I know this is small, and I apologize if this is difficult to see. Once again, these will be available. These slides will be available, and you're certainly more than welcome to ask me any questions about some of the specific conversations that we had during our focus groups. Like I said, independent activities tended to be the biggest impact, and that sort of stayed true throughout the entirety of our data collection. So we really used this information, like I said, over and over again. This was meant to be a starting point to give us an idea of what should we be talking about when we get to the EL-PFDD meeting. But it also gave us insight into, one of the things that the FDA recommended that was sort of a common occurrence for a lot of these EL-PFDD meetings was to do a more quantitative online survey for families to participate in, again, to continue informing us about what families felt like were the biggest impacts of peroxisomal disorders with respect to symptoms, as well as looking at the treatment landscape and what clinical trial needs were, even though we're not necessarily going to be talking about that tonight. So I'm going to pass it back over to Pamela, who's going to talk a little bit about the methodology of our survey, sort of using the information that we got from the focus group to inform the design of our survey. So Pamela, I'm going to hand it to you.
So, as Dr. Bose said, all of these topics mentioned during the focus group, as well as regulatory guidance from the FDA, helped us develop our surveys. And we actually did 2 surveys. We developed a survey for adult patients and another survey for caregivers of individuals with peroxisomal disorders. So the reason why you see in the slide the caregiver survey has more questions than the patient survey is to account for multiple children, as well as having an additional set of questions that were specifically for the impact of peroxisomal disorders on caregivers. So the questions included in the survey were multiple choice, multiple answer, ranking questions, and Likert scale questions. And then if we can go to the next slide.
Sorry, give me 1 second.
And then here are a few of our survey questions that are specific to symptoms and impacts. Once again, the survey included questions about symptoms, impacts, as well as current treatments and clinical trials. However, we'll be talking about the current treatments and clinical trials in June.
Okay. Once we developed our survey and we launched it, we launched it in early 2024, ahead of the EL-PFDD meeting, once again to serve as a way to sort of give us a little bit of insight of, how we should, even more insight onto how we should be organizing that, that EL-PFDD meeting in the most meaningful and impactful way. That's, like I said, the survey was launched in early 2024, and we actually opened it up. We kept it open until after the EL-PFDD meeting, just to collect, as many responses as we could. And at the end of the day, we were able to gather feedback from 53 caregivers that were representing 60 patients. And then the cool thing was we were able to get 2 patients to participate as well. And I really, the feedback that we get from our caregivers is obviously extremely important and valuable. But we were all really excited to get feedback from patients, just to see that sort of perspective and see what the similarities and the differences are across patients and caregivers. And I hope that, as we move forward with data collection, that we are able to continue to gather more voices of patients in addition to caregivers. Overall, we had the majority of the people that participated in the survey had ZSD. We did have some families with D bifunctional protein as well as other single enzyme deficiency disorders. We did have the participants were primarily if the patients, they were representing themselves, obviously, and the caregivers that were representing patients were primarily representing patients that were still living at the time, but we did have some feedback from individuals that were representing patients that were deceased. And we have a little bit of data sort of doing a compare and contrast of our findings. So I'm going to share that with you over the course of this talk. So let's start with talking about symptoms. So now we're able to get a little bit more quantitative data. So you're going to see a lot more graphs here. So this is really just this question the data from this question that was being asked is basically, do you or your loved one have any of these symptoms? And we just did a sort of a tally of the people that reported the different symptom categories. And before I get into the different symptom categories, the other thing that I thought was really interesting is, I really wanted to get an idea of how many symptoms patients were facing at one time. And because I'm not sure if there is data out there on that. So what we saw was that on average, patients experienced about 11 to 12 symptoms. It was 11.5. That was the mean that we got, symptoms at one time. And we can certainly talk about what are the implications of this later. Another thing that we found when we were trying to tally all this up is that we found the most frequently reported number of symptoms that an individual with a peroxisomal disorder had was about 9 symptoms. So that was the highest reported number. And then the maximum number of symptoms that we saw in one respondent that was representing just one patient was 27 symptoms. So again, we can talk about this, we can have a discussion about this later in the Q&A if we want. Now, when we were dividing them up into symptom categories, we found that the majority of the respondents reported hypotonia or low muscle tone as the most frequently reported symptom, followed by vision loss, hearing loss, as well as intellectual disability. So this information was really important in kind of validating some of the information that we got from the focus groups, and then really confirming, okay, these are topics that we really need to talk about that we may really need to talk about during the EL-PFDD meeting. So moving on, we're going to talk about what symptoms were the most impactful, and I'm going to share that right now. And so here, the question was the people that were participating in the survey were asked to rank. Once they chose every single symptom that they or their loved one had, those symptoms carried over into the next survey question and was like, okay, you've mentioned that you or your loved one has this many symptoms. Now rank them in terms of which are the most impactful. And so what you see here is the most top ranked symptoms. What we saw is that vision loss was the highest ranked symptom out of all the participants that took place in the survey, followed by intellectual disabilities. So when we were looking at this data, and then like I said before, we have a very we're a small group, but we're a very diverse group, right? So we were interested in looking at, are there differences across groups that may be at different points in their journey? We initially did like a cutoff with age, seeing if individuals under 10 had different impactful symptoms than individuals that were over 10. I think we've realized that maybe that type of division was not necessarily very informative. We'd also looked at respondents that were representing living patients versus respondents that were representing deceased patients. We did find some differences there. And what we saw is that, now keep in mind, we had many more respondents that were representing living patients than deceased patients, but in general, the vision loss as that top ranked symptom were mainly due to the fact that it was the respondents that were representing living patients that reported that. We did not see any respondents that were representing deceased patients report vision loss in their top ranked symptom. What we did see among these patients is that seizures and that leukodystrophy were the most top ranked symptoms among this subset of respondents representing PD patients. So that's the data that we have with respect to ranking the symptoms. We kind of asked these questions in a little bit different way, and we basically gave everybody, all of the survey respondents, access to rate how impactful. So a little bit more, getting a little bit more detail of like exactly how impactful, how do you quantify how impactful these symptoms are. And so then we did that through a Likert scale of rating from 1 to 10, where 10 is most impactful and 1 is the least impactful, or 0 actually is the least impactful. And so this is our data here. So these are the means or the averages of the rating scores with the standard error of the mean and the error bars there. And what we found is, and I'm going to share a little, faux pas that we made here when we were organizing the survey. One of the things that I have no idea why this happened. One of the things that we forgot to add in this rating scale was vision loss. That might be why it's not, you don't see this here as the highest rated symptom. What we do see is mobility issues as the most highest rated symptom, followed by intellectual disability. I will say though, if you look here at this third bar, it says symptom not listed, and Pamela, feel free to back me up here. When people were able to write in a symptom not listed and rate that, it was usually vision, because we forgot to put it in the survey. We won't do that again. So this is, I'm going to guess that if we did put vision or hearing loss in this, we probably would have seen numbers that were comparable to the impacts that we saw in mobility as well as intellectual disability. So once again, we tried to separate out these these scores across living and deceased respondents representing living and deceased patients. And we didn't see that much difference between the groups here, except for in seizures, where respondents were that were representing deceased patients reported a higher impact of seizures, as well as a higher impact of feeding issues compared to respondents that were representing living patients. And we could talk a little bit more about, why we saw these differences across groups as we get to our close. I just want to make sure that I get through all this data in an appropriate amount of time. When we asked respondents to rank the impacts, what were the most important impacts of peroxisomal disorders, again, what we saw was that the most highest ranked impact was that of independent activities. And once again, this means, independently being able to do activities of daily living, like bathing, feeding, dressing. And overwhelmingly, this was the most highest rated impact, followed by communication and social interactions. We also did a rating scale of these impacts, and they seem to be kind of equally important, but still overall we saw independent activities of daily living tending to be the most highest rated impact. And again, once again, it's the question was, how much how much of these impacts have affected your or your loved one's daily lives? And we see that that independent activities is really the biggest one. You may recall that in the focus groups we also included hospitalizations as well as other physical health. Because they were so infrequently discussed during the focus groups, although they were very important. And certainly by the time we got to the meeting, we realized that we probably should have included those answers in the survey as well. And we'll talk a little bit about the impact of these acute hospitalizations as well as overall health when we talk about the town hall meeting. So we also teased out the ratings of these impacts between respondents representing living and deceased patients, and didn't where we saw the majority of the differences were individuals representing living patients tended to rate independent, the impact of independent activities of daily living higher than respondents that were deceased. And same thing that we saw the similar trend with school and work performance. Now, I'm just gonna, jump in there and say we don't necessarily think that these this necessarily means that respondents that were representing individuals that were deceased did not think that independent activity or school and work performance were affected. We just feel like if we are going to be using the fact that these respondents are representing deceased individuals as a sort of surrogate for, they probably had a more severe form of the disease and they had much more urgent issues that they were contending with at the time than independent activities of daily living and school and work performance. So that is that's basically the summary of the data that we're going to be sharing from the surveys. This is not a comprehensive, not all of the survey data, but in the interest of time, we just wanted to show you some of what we felt were the most important. Now, moving on to the town hall meeting, the sort of structure of the town hall meeting was this. As the moderator, I asked questions very similar to the questions that were asked during the focus groups, but now we had a bit of a structure of what topics we wanted to focus on because we had all of this data from the focus groups and from the survey. So we had this facilitated discussion where panelists came up and shared about specific topics that we prioritized in this town hall meeting. And with respect to symptoms, these are the ones that the specific topics that we asked people to discuss. In addition to that facilitated discussion where I was moderating, if you remember, we also had live polling that you were able to do through a mobile app. So I'm going to share some of that quantitative data as well. But like I said, with respect to symptoms, these were the major symptoms that we focused on during the town hall meeting, where people were able to give their feedback and share their lived experiences, either as a caregiver representing a patient with a peroxisomal disorder or a patient themselves. So I'm going to start with some of the data that we got from the live polling. Once again, we asked what are the most impactful symptoms in this live polling setting, and once again, we found that that sensory impairment, the vision loss, the hearing loss, as well as the dual sensory loss, the deaf blindness, those were the biggest impacts of peroxisomal disorders that these respondents felt that patients were experiencing in their daily lives. So I'm going to go through all of these topics that I just highlighted here, and share some of the concepts or the themes that we found in the discussion of these symptoms, as well as some quotes. And I'm not going to be talking about these quotes in great detail, but happy to share these slides as well as any additional data. If you want to look at some of additional quotes, I'm happy to share that too. In general, when we had the discussion on sensory impairment, we talked about vision loss individually, hearing loss individually, as well as the dual sensory loss. And vision loss, generally, topics were talking about retinal degeneration and cataracts. People mentioned cortical visual impairment. And here you have some quotes that you see here that are really exemplifying some of these topics that I've sort of bulleted here on the left. Hearing loss was generally bilateral, and this was sensory neural hearing loss. And we'll talk a little bit about progression of these symptoms in the context of leukodystrophy, but with hearing loss, it generally tended to be moderate to profound. And there were also discussions on dual sensory loss, and really highlighting the not even an additive, really an exponential impact of this dual sensory loss on an individual's daily life. The next panel that we had was on mobility symptoms. And here you can see some of the specific symptoms that fell under this mobility category. And for both the sensory impairment and the mobility symptoms panel, we had adults representing with peroxisomal disorder representing themselves. And a lot of these quotes here are from those patients, which again, love my caregivers, love all the feedback and the insight they give us. But I was really excited to get some of that direct patient feedback as well. So again, a lot of these symptoms were related back to low muscle tone, but there were also other orthopedic symptoms that contributed to some of the mobility challenges that our patients and caregivers shared that patients were facing. We talked about gastrointestinal, and when I'm talking about gastrointestinal symptoms, we're talking not just about feeding, reflux, and all of the things that we have to face there, but also looking at liver, because liver is part of the gastrointestinal organ system. So there was a lot of discussion about liver during the gastrointestinal symptoms panel. One of the things that I will note here that I feel like we were able to get into a lot more that I feel like is not really discussed at length are a lot of the bleeding issues, and most of the time the bleeding issues were related to GI bleeding, and part of this could be due to the malabsorption of vitamin K. There was also discussion of portal hypertension, which is this is a liver issue that contributed to some of these bleeding issues. And I was really not happy, obviously, but I was really just really invested in some of these discussions about the bleeding issues, because we don't, personally, I feel like this is something that we don't talk about enough. Some other symptoms that we talked about were intellectual disabilities, and we had a whole panel on that, particularly looking at older patients, teenage patients, and adult patients. I've shared some quotes here. In a small subset of patients, generally caregivers that were representing deceased individuals, there was discussion, or individuals that later in life experienced respiratory symptoms, and these respiratory symptoms may have been related to the low muscle tone, but a lot of times what would end up happening is that it would make them very prone to respiratory infections. We'll talk a little bit about that when we get to impacts. We talked about seizures. I'm not going into the detail of the types of seizures, but really just sort of the how the seizures presented, and what sort of impact they had on patient lives at that moment. We talked a little bit about dental symptoms, a little bit about kidney symptoms. And I've shared some quotes here. One of the important symptom categories that we talked about was this idea of leukodystrophy. We know leukodystrophy as, white matter deterioration in the brain. But in general, what it presented as in patients is either the appearance of new symptoms throughout a patient's journey, or deterioration of existing symptoms. So the question here in the polling was asking, has your symptoms gotten better or worse over time? Whether it's to a patient or a caregiver representing a patient with a peroxisomal disorder. And all across the board, what we saw was that the symptoms have gotten worse over time. And I'm going to guess that at least part of that has to do with the white matter deterioration that's happening in the brain. So let's talk a little bit about impacts. Okay, so here's a little bit more, I mentioned some of these, details before, but when we're talking about independent activity, we're talking about the inability to do activities of daily living, which then made patients reliant on their caregivers to do these activities for them, made some patients reliant on assistive tools and devices, and that inability to do certain activities may led to other impacts like, safety issues, as well as increased physical injury. We mentioned social interactions and communications, which then had this additional impact of isolation. We'll talk a little bit about that emotional impact of peroxisomal disorders on patients. We talked about school and work activities. When we mentioned executive functioning, we're talking about decision-making, emotional regulation, memory focus. We had this category of everyday health, and that's where we sort of categorize the physical health and emotional health. And then finally, we had this sort of, we talk a lot about these daily impacts, but a topic that was, that was discussed in both focus groups as well as in the meeting were these acute impacts, like these hospitalizations, like these medical interventions. So I'm going to share a little bit on all of these categories. When we asked in the polling, how much have these symptoms impacted and what are the specific impacts? Once again, we see an impact on independent activities of daily living. So I'm going to just transition into that slide where I share some of the quotes. And the major thing that we found, probably the reason that we see this big effect on independent activities of daily living has to do with the fact that nearly every single symptom category that we looked at had these impacts on daily living. Vision loss had an impact on independence. Mobility challenges had an impact on independence. Cognitive function had an impact on independence. Seizures made it really difficult to conduct activities of daily living. And then the leukodystrophy itself and the progression of these symptoms. So that's how these tables are being organized, is looking at these different impacts and then really trying to relate them back to what are the symptoms that are contributing to these impacts. So with communication, there is, the sensory impairment, obviously that has an impact, but the intellectual disability, as well as, and this may seem sort of weird, but, mobility symptoms made it so that, individuals had more limited interactions with other people, with friends and family. So there was an impact of mobility on social interactions and communications. With respect to school and work activities, we see intellectual disability being the big driver here, but also mobility and sensory loss as well. When we're looking at executive functioning, the biggest driver was definitely the intellectual disability, but certainly a lot of respondents, a lot of participants, whether they were, representing themselves as patients or caregivers representing patients, really talked about fatigue, really making it difficult to, to engage in things like decision making or memory focus. So let's talk a little bit about impacts on everyday health. And we sort of, like I said, we divided this into physical health and emotional health. So this is, in some of these sample categories. And again, these are just, this is just a snapshot. There's a lot more information here. Remember, we have 8 hours of data plus all of the data from, everything else that we collected. One of the things that we saw were impacts on nutrition. This is something that obviously we're very interested in because this is what we do. But individuals reported that GI bleeds made it difficult to tolerate feedings, as well as some parents shared that dental symptoms made it difficult to eat. There was, again, reports on fatigue due to things like bleeding and anemia, and that made it difficult to participate in just any everyday activity. I'm going to share some of the impacts on emotional health. And here we're focusing on the patients, but it should not be ignored. And, you all know this, that this is, this has these diseases have an impact on both patients, really extensively, as well as caregivers. And a lot of times the emotional health of the patient will affect the emotional health of the caregiver, and the emotional health of the caregiver will then affect the emotional health of the patient. So, I don't think these are in silos. It's just that in the interest of time, we're just talking a little bit about some of the what was reported with respect to emotional impacts on patients. And this includes, anxiety, that we saw from some of our adult patients, what parents perceived as confusion and fear, frustration and devastation for not being able to do a lot of these everyday tasks, and a lot of real uncertainty, again, from both patients as well as caregivers as to what's going to happen next. And this is something that we all hear from our families all the time. So finally, in terms of impacts, and we'll start to move towards our conclusions, talking about, these are not daily impacts, but more acute impacts, but they still had a pretty, significant effect on the overall, quality of life of individuals. And this includes, hospitalizations or medical interventions. So generally, the symptom categories that we saw that would contribute to hospitalizations or medical interventions had to do with some of the more severe symptoms, like the GI bleeds that were oftentimes requiring transfusions, as well as the respiratory symptoms, which I said before would oftentimes lead to infections, as well as pneumonia. And then other parents reported some more acute infections that would also land their child in the hospital as well. So that was a pretty, although it was not discussed by everybody, for the people that did have to experience these hospitalizations, they had a pretty significant impact on their overall quality of life for the patients as well as the caregivers. So to sort of start coming towards our conclusions, Pamela did this really amazing job of trying to summarize everything that I've just shared with you over the last hour, kind of connecting how the different symptoms impact the different impacts, these different aspects of daily life. And once again, you see, so many different symptom categories affecting independent activity. You also see these symptoms affecting, communication, social interactions, school and work performance, executive functioning, everyday health. And, although, like I said, we didn't necessarily see everybody talking about hospitalizations or medical interventions, there, for the people that this was their reality, there were many symptom categories that would result in some of these impacts. So to sum up, I'm going to say, I think one of the big takeaways is our patients have a lot of symptoms, and it's a pretty significant burden. And, and I think we all know this, right, as family members. But, now it's about taking this information and making sure that the right people are hearing it so that, there is more movement towards, new treatments that address this huge symptom burden that our patients are facing. And with respect to that symptom burden, I think what we saw was sensory impairment and, the issues related to low muscle tone, as well as intellectual disability, tended to be the most impactful symptoms. All three of these symptom categories had an impact on independent activities of daily living, as well, in some cases, as well as communication and social interactions. We did see some differences across symptom burden between respondents representing living and those representing deceased patients. This is something that I feel like we need to tease apart more and really looking at some of the other like demographic variables and what are the difference. I don't feel like we did I think there's more to be done in terms of really teasing that apart. So I'm hoping that we can, as we continue on in this, that we'll be able to like see if there are, these differences, at least in the data that we are collecting. So let's talk really quickly about what next steps are going to be. Like I said, we're still in the analysis phase of the second parts of this data collection, looking at current treatments, the current treatment landscape, as well as what is needed for future treatments. But I'm going to share a little teaser on some of that data before we finish up here. One of the things that we need to do is develop this voice of the patient report, which Pamela and I and the rest of my team are working on right now. And part of that voice of the patient report is going to be doing a real risk-benefit assessment for existing PD treatments to really emphasize how newer, better treatments are needed. And, we collected a lot of data here, guys, thanks to all of you. And, the voice of the patient report is important. In terms of informing future clinical trials, but we can use this information for so many different things. So, Katie, as well as other members of the GFPD, and I've been talking a lot about how to use this data for community resources to help inform the public and help us better understand, what, our community's experiences are. One of the things that we're talking about doing is developing a little one-sheeter fact sheet that we could hopefully disseminate across, interested stakeholders. And so this is some of the information that we gathered from this data with respect to, that we thought would be important key points, like really nice talking points about, the symptom burden and being very explicit about, 11 to 12 symptoms at a time. And I remember when Pamela was doing her thesis defense, she had told her audience, which weren't, peroxisomal disorder patients or family members, like, just imagine if you have a cold and you've got a runny nose and a sore throat and you're achy, and that, has a really big impact of your day. Try to multiply that by 3, 4, 5, and then think about how that's going to have an impact on your day. So I thought that was a really good analogy that she used during her thesis defense. And then as well as just talking a little bit about, some of the specifics of the symptoms as well as the impact. And I have another student who may be here tonight who is working on current treatments, and we're just starting to get some of our data together. And the one thing that just really blew my mind, although I guess I kind of knew this, is that, on average, based on our data, patients are paroxysmal disorder patients are administered anywhere from 13 to 4, this is on average, 13 to 14 treatments at one time to manage symptoms. So this is a big deal, guys. So, we really need to get this messaging out there. So I'm going to finish up, and I know I've sort of gone over, and I apologize, but I just want to say thank you to so many different people that helped us put this together, including our regulatory stakeholders, the members of the FDA that really helped guide us in what we were doing. So we'll take a few questions, and Katie, sorry for going
It's
over.
okay. It's great information, and I am so glad that you both were here to share this with everyone. I know we went over, but again, like you said, it was an 8-hour meeting. We had 2 years of different focus groups and surveys and just everything leading up to even that 8-hour town hall meeting. So understandable to go a little bit over.
Yeah,
Just a
I mean, and
reminder.
I'll be happy to take whatever questions that need to be that we want to focus on now. But I'm always, Katie, please feel free to share my email address, and if anybody
Yes.
has any additional questions, I'm happy to talk about them, offline.
Yep. And just a reminder to anyone who may just thought of a question, we do have that Q&A button at the bottom, and then we also have chat. And either one is, will work and get through to us. I do have 2 different questions that came in that are very related. So I'm going to just share both of these questions. So maybe you could answer and address both of
Sure
them.
thing, no problem.
The first one, they both are related to the fatigue that you were talking about, the impact of fatigue. And so it's on one of the slides it had mentioned fatigue from GI symptoms. And then, so one of the questions came in specific to that of how was it determined to know the cause of the fatigue, since we know that sensory loss can, increase fatigue because of just the work it takes to gather information. And then we also had a separate question that came in from a different individual regarding how much of the fatigue do you think is the result of dealing with all of these symptoms, or is the fatigue a standalone symptom of ZSD?
I think these are all really, really important questions. And, my intention was not to imply that the fatigue was just being caused by these GI bleeds. This is just some of the data that we got. I would, I would expect that fatigue is probably caused by a lot of these symptoms. And certainly, if we're sitting here reporting that, saying that we have patients that have 11 to 12 symptoms at a time, or at least 9, even 9 symptoms at a time, that's a lot to contend with, right? I don't doubt for a second that the burden, that, this huge quantitative symptom burden has a tremendous impact on an individual's fatigue. And I'm going to guess that sort of spills over into the caregiver's fatigue, level of fatigue as well. So, I'm sorry, I did not mean to imply that this was, the fatigue was just related. It's just that this is the sort of snapshot of the data that we have. I'm positive that many other symptoms cause fatigue. I don't know to say, if we were to say the question with respect to whether or not fatigue itself is a symptom of the disease, I don't really know if we can really determine that. I feel like, a lot of the fatigue really just has to do with the low muscle tone, and having such an impact on all these other symptoms. So I feel like I would probably put this in the category of impacts as opposed to a symptom, especially since we know that all of these multitudes of symptoms can cause fatigue. So that's my thoughts on it.
Thank you for sharing that. I think this is even just a great example too of how this data is so important to, at some point someone may want to look into that. And now they have that's information, and they can take it and do additional work. So we also, I just want to make a quick comment to, if somebody asks a question, sometimes somebody else is thinking it. So we did have someone ask a question about, vision loss was mentioned as being one of the top impactful symptoms. And
Right.
so there was some confusion about, how can that be when there's a lot of individuals who are nonverbal, and how you get that vision measured. And so I just wanted to comment for anybody else listening, wondering that I'm going to send some follow-up. So please reach out to me if you'd like. I'm going to send follow-up to who asked that question. And if you are an additional person in the audience who wants to learn more about that, please reach out to me and I'm happy to get you that information. We do have another question about, how all this comes together. So how does this information about symptoms, how many and their impacts translate into meaningful information regarding the disease burden of paroxysmal disorders to people that make decisions about clinical trials? So how does it all come together?
So I think, just starting here and collecting this data is probably the most important step, right? And then I think, I've been doing in the research that I've been doing with respect to sort of understanding like quality of life. I won't lie. When I got this information on the number of symptoms, I was like, this is crazy. This is so, to me, that was very impactful. But, doing some more digging, like there's, it's to really, um, assess disease burden. It takes it's not just number of symptoms. Obviously, it's all of these other things like the impacts, and how long somebody has been dealing with symptoms. So what I'm hoping that we can do is start here, as talking points, but really take some of this quantitative data and use, apply what are the overall standards for quantifying disease burden, that is accepted, and use this and apply those sort of equations to be able to give meaningful information, in a very contextual manner, that this disease sucks, right? And that, we as family members, we need help, so that's there's a lot of steps involved in there, but we've done the legwork, right? We've collected this data. Now it's about trying to figure out what's the best way that we can fit into this, into really explicitly saying this is a significant disease burden. I will say though, I have, if you guys want a little bit of like reference, I was looking at, because we have this information, I was looking at some literature that tried to quantify disease burden based on number of symptoms. And I haven't seen this very much in rare disease, but I have seen a lot of this done in cancer. And in general, among cancer patients, if you have more than 5 symptoms associated with your condition, then that's considered a heavy disease burden. So take that information and do with that what you will. But I think right then and there, we've got a very important story to tell, right?
Absolutely. And I think there's some questions that have come in, and you hear these a lot, and about the cure and treatments and timelines. So I don't want to ignore those types of questions. I want to just kind of
Can
highlight
we
that
do
there are
one
the
more question? Is that
differences.
okay?
Yes, absolutely. And so just really addressing that there are different treatments, for symptomatic treatments and things like that. I think that the question that I can tie in there for those types of questions that did come in about cure and treatments and timelines would be, you did share about the treatment for paroxysmal disorders is coming soon. They were on the slide. So what will that be? Is that a publishing? Will it be for everyone who has paroxysmal disorders? We know we have those treatment guidelines out there.
Right.
So what's coming down the pipeline, and what does that look like? Can you share that with our audience?
Sure thing. As I said, we're analyzing the data for the current treatment landscape for these disorders. We're planning on doing another webinar just like this, sharing that information. This information is going to be included in the Voice of the Patient report. But, since we do have IRB approval, the plan is to really try to publish this data in peer-reviewed literature, because we have the ability to do that. And there's not a whole lot of precedence in sharing EL-PFDD data in scientific literature. but I think we can change that. And I feel like that's gonna be a really important segue into really incorporating, allowing these different stakeholders from different backgrounds to really connect and really understand, what are the important topics to consider when not just developing treatments for peroxisomal disorders, but all rare diseases. Did that answer your question?
Absolutely. I love that we can make that happen. We can make that change. You can see that coming to fruition. I love that. That's part of, making the difference in the lives of our warriors. So thank you so much for being here. Anybody else who, asked great questions, I will follow up with you. And like Dr. Bose shared, she's always available as well. I will share her email and touch base with her with some of the other questions that we have. And I just am really grateful to Pamela and Dr. Bose. I'm excited to have you returning in July with an additional colleague to present landscape of current treatments for peroxisomal disorders, what we learned from the EL-PFDD meeting part 2. And just really thank you again for all of the work you've done over the past 2+ years now, for taking the time to share this crucial data today and helping others to know how this data can be used. We know this data is just really going to make a difference. To our audience on the screen, if Dr. Bose would go to the next slide on the screen, you're going to see a QR code, and that QR code will take you, there is a section on the GFPD website that will take you right. This QR code will take you there, and it's all about the EL-PFDD meeting. It has recordings if anybody was not able to be there, or it was just a lot of information. If you want to just go back and kind of recap different sections, it's broken up on there. It goes all the way back to the webinar that Dr. Bose shared of what is this EL-PFDD meeting? Why do we have to have this meeting, and why is it so important? So all of that information's on there. And then again, the resources that we're going to be creating, the recording from this webinar will be there. So, know that these resources are there. They're on the website. Thank you again for participating with us. And if you would also take a moment to complete a survey that will be sent to all of you by email. And thank you again. Have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you all.
Thank you all. Thank you.